Thank you, Dr. Macrina. We're going to move now to a broader concept of ethics and governance of science with Professor Bruce Jennings, who is Director of Bioethics from the Center for Humans and Nature, and very recently Professor of Health Policy at Vanderbilt University.
Thank you very much. I would certainly like to thank the committee for giving me the opportunity to be here and take part in this workshop today in the hope of providing you with some ideas that may be useful as food for thought as we go forward. My purpose today is to address aspects of science governance and ethical roles for the scientific community in achieving responsible innovation in the domain of genomic and ecological biotechnology. These are some of the points that I will mention in the course of my presentation. I want to say a couple of preliminary words about my approach, which is that I am first using the term governance in a broader sense than simply governmental policy and law and regulation. I mean governance as a structuring activity of complex social and economic and scientific knowledge and technology that is sort of broadly based in the entire civil society, which includes the professions as well as other civic groups and, of course, the governmental authorities in an elected democracy. I also want to say that I'm approaching this in a somewhat unusual way because we often talk about the ethical issues in emerging technology by looking at the sort of phase of proof of concept, so to speak, the initial research to understand the mechanisms in question, to imagine if these mechanisms can be well understood and controlled and implemented, what some of the outcomes and effects and risks might be, and so forth and so on. That's all extremely important, and a great deal of our conversation here is about that sort of thing. I'm kind of looking beyond it to ask the question of what kind of system will we have in the offing if gene drives do work and do become widely used. I'm looking at this also from a perspective of not simply a tool that may produce very beneficial outcomes, but as a system of social and institutional power that asks us the question of how we should use that power in how does it affect the relationship between human beings and nature, and how does it affect the relationships that we have in our own society and culture. So I'm taking a slightly different tack with my approach here. I also have some sort of working assumptions that I start with. A biotechnology, in my view, or any technology, is not simply an apparatus and instrumentality. It involves a complex structure of social organization, institutional power, and cultural meaning. Secondly, there's something uncanny about fabricating life with nearly the same facility that inorganic matter and energy are manipulated. The recent advent of what has been called facile genomic engineering has moved the uncanny from the realm of science fiction to impending science fact. Both the scientific community and the lay communities perceive this, but I think there is typically a significant gulf separating their respective interpretations and responses to this sense of the uncanny. Third, I believe that the sense of the uncanny here, surrounding biotechnology and genomics, is linked to great hope, but it's also gives us a growing unease, wariness, and distrust. This is serious because it threatens the legitimacy and integrity of the governance of science and technology. My fourth working assumption is that this unease does not stem solely from the concern that biotechnology will be dangerous or that it will be misused by human agents. It also grows out of a different kind of sense. It grows out of the realization that institutionalized science and technology innovation has a logic and a social and political agency of its own. Science and technology are not best understood just as something that we use or abuse. They are powers that may use or abuse us as a society. The question of how much and in what ways we should control the natural world is not finally separable from the question of how much and in what ways we should control the human world. A global bioeconomy is being built rapidly. The normative ethical work of governing it proceeds slowly. Let me now turn to a discussion of general sort of regimes of science and technology innovation and governance. And I want to contrast three types of regimes briefly. One I'm referring to as a command and control regime. Another I'm referring to as a market regime. And a third I refer to as a regime of civic responsibility and responsible research and innovation, a model. And I'll try to explain the difference between particularly the market model and the civic model as we go along. I do this in order then to specify what I think some of the value concerns beyond the criteria of safety, effectiveness, and efficiency might be in terms of the governance and the public discussion and decision-making concerning how we can responsibly innovate in science and technology for the common good. So a command and control regime of science governance is directed by central responsible agents. It is a governance of elite authority and elite expertise. Access to the use of a technology and entry into the process of innovation is limited and explicitly rule-governed. In this type of governance regime, those responsible for the innovation and its dissemination are usually specifically identifiable parties, government agencies, scientific bodies, and the like. Someone with a proper name can be praised if innovation goes well and blamed if it does not. The rules governing innovation and its dissemination are determined by elite expertise and authority. Most often, this type of regime relies heavily on an appraisal process that is science-driven, objective, and mainly reliant on quantitative assessment methods. For example, cellular communication technology may be resisted on health and safety grounds, i.e. banning texting while driving. It may also be restricted on grounds of threats to political and social stability, such as controls on internet access or the use of social media, which may be used to organize protest demonstrations. Now, a market regime of science governance, innovations are produced and distributed through market mechanisms based on commercial property rights. In this arrangement, the role of any single control agent, whether individual or collective, is eliminated or greatly reduced. Such governance reflects and is made possible by the collective and institutional nature of scientific and technological innovation. The controlling agency of any particular scientist or group is increasingly difficult to designate, particularly after the research and discovery phase and in the implementation phase and innovation phase. If gene-drive technologies come into widespread use to serve goals of public health and conservation biology, who will be responsible for that precisely? My point is that production and evaluation of an innovation is an impersonal, collective process, not a personal one. In a market regime, both technical and value-based appraisal takes place, but here, most cost-benefit and risk-benefit appraisals are not the exclusive purview of technical experts, but are made by corporate decision-makers, investors, and consumers. And they are cultural, strategic, and political, which is to say, qualitative as well as quantitative matters of bounded rationality, not purely technical rationality. Indeed, this more populist form of governance is appealing to the extent that one is skeptical about the objectivity and rationality of elite and expert risk-benefit appraisal in a command and control regime. If the net social and personal benefit of if an innovation is something that any appropriately informed and self-interested consumer should be able to determine, then governance should permit market demand to operate as a social metric of acceptable risk and benefit. Doing otherwise is an expression of paternalistic elitism, unless the conditions for informed consent and consumer choice in a market for technology are not met for some reason. Then limited command and control regulations will be focused on removing such shortcomings. Regulations concerning labeling, advertising, health warnings, and the like. Thus, command and control governance is pressed into the service of market governance, and I'm not trying to suggest that these exist in isolation. Both regimes are always interactive and operative together, but the market governance tends to become predominant, as we have seen time and time again in biotechnology and public health. Two examples of this, one older, one more recent, that come to my mind are the movement from a kind of command and control to a kind of market governance in the case of the technology of hemodialysis, and also in the development of the technologies of in vitro fertilization, assisted medical reproduction. In both of those cases in the United States, unlike in European countries and elsewhere, essentially the command and control governance has been small or non-existent, and it has been thrown open to a kind of market approach where individual decisions about the use of the technology are essentially made in the context of a physician-patient relationship and that sort of thing. As those technologies, especially artificial reproduction in vitro fertilization, meet with the new powers of genetic testing and genomic engineering, I think we're going to have an interesting test of whether or not that technology should continue to be governed in this sort of market regime fashion, or whether some kind of command and control intervention, or indeed some kind of more civic model needs to be brought into play. Now let's see. As we move from a command and control regime to a market regime, to a kind of popularized, populistic ethical appraisal and assessment, one of the things that happens, I think, is that in the ethical discourse and debate and argumentation, it becomes increasingly difficult to appeal to what might be called deontic or absolutist or duty-based ethical considerations, and that consequentialist, outcomes-oriented, benefit and burden, benefit and risk considerations take over most of the domain of ethical discourse, as well as the technological assessment of the innovation in question. It becomes very difficult to say that something is categorically wrong. There are some things that money should not be allowed to buy, and so on. The question, should we do this, shifts to the question, is doing this effective, efficient, and safe? And if so, are a sufficiently large number of people willing to pay for it? Is there something between elite objectivity, which is often tainted with conflicts of interest or hubris, on the one hand, and the crowdsourcing, so to speak, of science governance through the marketplace of consumer choice on the other? I think we do need to find a third alternative, if only because there are some warning signs building up in our culture of trouble ahead for the politics and governance of biotechnology. Here's my attempt to characterize some of those warning signs. Biotechnology is being developed and marketed by private corporations that we can no longer trust to be publicly responsible, nor even constrained by market competition. The biotechnology industry is being regulated by government agencies that are captured and whose ideological heart is not in the activity of regulation. And the consuming public itself has no moral compass to serve as a restraining force on biotechnology either, because we, in the marketplace and as privatized citizens, seemingly cannot say no to anything that offers us or our families health, enhancement, or longevity. And here I'm speaking about the sort of public health or the human health feedback loop of environmental interventions as well. Because again, we tend to use the touchstone of the effects on human well-being as a criteria for the ethical justification of environmental, ecological interventions by human technology. A deontological claim, as many environmental ethicists make, that there is an intrinsic value to other species, an intrinsic value to an ecosystem that has evolved over a long period of time, should not be disrupted, should be respected. That sort of argument is very current in some portions of the environmental movement and in academic environmental ethics, but has much less traction, I think, at the level of public policy and science governance generally. Although those arguments, I think, are worth taking into consideration. I'll try to do so in a moment. So do we need to develop a new governance regime of civically responsible innovation rather than either an exclusively consequentialist ethical appraisal by experts or a populist ethical appraisal by consumers? And is this convergence of gene drive, artificial anthropogenic evolution, and very precise modes now of genomic editing, does this provide us with an opportunity, a moment in which we can rethink the nature of the governance regime that we ought to try to build, anticipating a time when these sorts of technologies become commercially available and widely used for a variety of purposes? I think that a civic appraisal is within our grasp. I think that we can, in fact, enhance what we now speak of as public engagement and citizen deliberation and discussion. But in order to do so, we need to be a little clearer on what some of the guiding ethical notions might be, and we also have to pay attention to the difference between a kind of civic deliberation where people think like public citizens and those deliberations in which they think like private consumers. And that is a fundamental difference. And how do we create the forums so that the former rather than the latter is not, comes to the fore, so that we won't just have fights among special interest groups. I think three of the principles that are important here could be called a precautionary focus or orientation, an ontological focus, and a humanistic focus on humility. And basically, I will quickly summarize those 3 points by saying that the precautionary focus is something that calls for enhanced civic and public involvement in the discussion of risk and benefits and the social value and the social justification for moving forward with science and technology. The Presidential Commission, in its report on synthetic biology, called for a prudent principle of governance involving watchful waiting. And that's very sensible and also practical approach to governance, except for the fact that it's not entirely clear, at least to me, what we're watchfully waiting for and how we'll know what it is when it arrives. Watchful waiting alone requires some specification of what might lead us to either pull back or move forward with a technology. Finally, the humility idea is simply my way of suggesting that much of the discussion of the last session seems to me to ring very true. We need to be quite mindful of the complexity with which we're dealing. We sometimes seem to treat this as if it was a kind of matter of cassettes or Legos or pieces that we can assemble and reassemble. I think that we really need, especially in the ecological and biogenomic context, to be mindful of the emergent properties and of the systemic complexities that we are involving ourselves with, and to sort of understand, perhaps, that we are creatures as well as creators, that we are people who need to accommodate to natural systems as well as engineer and re-engineer them. So my take-home points really call for a good expanded civic conversation, not just a private interest group conversation, better discourse between the molecular experts and scientists and the ecologists, and the notion that we need to proceed not only with precaution and caution, but also with asking ourselves, who are we really and what does a right relationship with natural systems look like? Thank you very much.